A quiet life, a loyal companion. In the small, peaceful town of Pine Hollow, where the nights were silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl or rustling of leaves, lived an elderly man named James Jim Marshall. His life was quiet and undisturbed, lived mostly within the cozy, worn walls of his cottage, nestled near the edge of town. Jim's home was a simple place, filled with old books, hand-knit blankets, and photos of his late wife, Ella. Ella had been the love of his life, his constant for decades, and her absence had left Jim with a hollow ache that nothing could truly fill. But Jim wasn't alone. He had Duke, a robust and intelligent Labrador with a coat as black as midnight and eyes that seemed to hold worlds of understanding. Duke had been his companion since the day Ella passed away. He'd adopted Duke as a scrawny pup from the shelter, a move spurred by his daughter, Claire, who had noticed her father's loneliness. Duke had been Jim's faithful friend, his comfort in solitude, and his protector, always by his side as they took their morning walks along Pine Hollow's scenic paths. There was something about Duke, his intuition, his fierce loyalty, his silent strength, that had made him a vital part of Jim's life. Jim had retired from his work as an architect nearly 2 decades ago. His projects still dotted the town in the form of quaint homes and modest public buildings, structures he had poured his heart into. Despite his retirement, he was a beloved figure in Pine Hollow. Folks knew him for his gentle wisdom, and it wasn't uncommon for neighbors to stop by for a cup of tea and some friendly advice. Jim's life was simple, filled with routines that gave him peace, including his morning coffee, his evening walks, and most importantly, his quiet moments with Duke. Duke had grown from a spirited pup into a vigilant, wise dog, and the bond between him and Jim had grown deep and unbreakable over the years. Duke could sense Jim's every mood, comforting him in times of sorrow, and celebrating in moments of joy. In many ways, Jim's life revolved around Duke, and Duke's around Jim. Their connection was something beyond companionship. It was family. One of the regular visitors to Jim's cottage was a young boy named Tommy Harris. Tommy, 8 years old with bright red hair and a gap-toothed smile, was a neighborhood fixture with boundless curiosity and an infectious laugh. He would stop by Jim's home every few days, sometimes to borrow a book, other times simply to chat. Jim enjoyed the boy's company. He reminded him of his own childhood and the simpler times of life. For Tommy, Jim and Duke's home was a sanctuary. His own family life was difficult. His mother, Kelly, was a single parent working 2 jobs to make ends meet, and Tommy's father had left them when he was barely a toddler. With his mother often working late, Tommy spent much of his time alone. He looked up to Jim as a mentor, a guide, and sometimes even as the grandfather he wished he had. Jim, in turn, was fond of Tommy and did his best to fill his life with warmth and kindness, often sharing stories about his younger days and teaching him about nature, literature, and life's mysteries. Duke, too, adored Tommy, greeting him each time with an eager wagging tail and a bark of excitement. Jim had a small patch of land beside his cottage where he cultivated a garden over the years. In autumn, the garden would burst with color, bright orange marigolds, deep red chrysanthemums, and the last blooms of lavender before the winter chill set in. Jim loved tending to his garden, and Duke would often lie nearby, watching him work, his eyes following Jim's every move. One sunny autumn morning, Jim decided to take Duke for a longer walk than usual. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy smell of fallen leaves and wood smoke from nearby chimneys. The sky was clear, with the sun casting a golden glow over Pine Hollow. As they strolled along the path by the river, Jim hummed an old tune under his breath, one Ella used to sing on their walks together. He felt a wave of nostalgia and sadness, and Duke, ever perceptive, nudged Jim's hand with his nose, as if to reassure him. Jim smiled and scratched Duke's head, grateful for the comforting presence by his side. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. His hand flew to his heart, and his face twisted in agony. He staggered, clutching his chest as the world around him seemed to blur and darken. Duke sensed the change instantly, his ears pricking up as he watched Jim collapse onto the ground. The dog barked furiously, a sound so loud and intense it echoed through the quiet morning. He pawed at Jim's motionless body, whining, his eyes filled with panic and fear. Nearby, a jogger named Rachel Walker had heard Duke's frantic barking. She rushed to the scene, her eyes widening in shock as she saw Jim lying unconscious on the ground, with Duke protectively standing over him. She quickly pulled out her phone and called for help, her voice trembling as she explained the situation to the dispatcher. The seconds seemed to stretch into eternity as she waited for help to arrive, trying to calm Duke, who wouldn't let her near Jim. Moments later, the sound of sirens filled the air as an ambulance and police car arrived. The paramedics prepared to approach Jim, but Duke blocked their path, growling low and steady. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on Jim, his instincts driving him to protect his beloved human. The paramedics hesitated, unsure how to handle the dog's intense loyalty. They needed to reach Jim, but Duke's stance made it clear he wouldn't allow anyone near him without a fight. Among the police officers was a young woman named Officer Claire Thompson. Claire had recently returned to Pine Hollow after years of working in a big city, drawn back by a longing for the community she'd grown up in. She recognized Jim immediately. He was a friend of her late grandfather and had often offered her encouragement when she was a young girl. The sight of him lying there so still, with Duke fiercely guarding him, stirred a wave of emotion within her. She understood Duke's reaction. She knew he wasn't being aggressive, but was terrified of losing the one person he loved most. Slowly, Claire approached Duke, speaking in a calm, soothing voice. "Duke, it's okay. It's me, Claire. You know me." She extended her hand carefully, her voice steady. "I'm here to help Jim. I need you to trust me." Duke's growling quieted, his intense gaze softening as he recognized her. He allowed her to come closer, his body tense but not threatening. Claire reached Jim and checked his pulse, feeling a weak but steady beat. She quickly signaled to the paramedics, and they approached with caution, their movements careful and respectful of Duke's presence. As they loaded Jim into the ambulance, Duke tried to follow, barking as if to protest being left behind. Claire, her heart aching for the loyal dog, gently held him back, promising softly, "I'll bring you to him, Duke, I promise." She watched as the ambulance drove away, feeling the weight of the moment. Duke, now sitting beside her, looked up at her with trusting, hopeful eyes, as if he understood her words. Claire knew she couldn't let Duke down, not after witnessing such loyalty and love. Back at the station, Claire arranged for Duke to be cared for, though she noticed he refused to eat or sleep, his focus entirely on waiting for Jim's return. Duke's loyalty began to resonate throughout Pine Hollow, inspiring people to rally around Jim and Duke. News of the incident spread quickly, and the community began to prepare for Jim's recovery and Duke's unwavering vigil. But as days passed and Jim remained unconscious in the hospital, a question began to take root in Claire's mind. A question about the nature of loyalty, loss, and the sacrifices we make for those we love. She couldn't shake the feeling that Duke and Jim's bond was something truly extraordinary, something that went beyond mere companionship. And as she found herself growing more involved in their story, Claire realized she, too, was about to embark on a journey that would change her life and the lives of those around her forever. An unexpected bond. The days following Jim's collapse were somber in Pine Hollow. Word of Jim's condition spread through the town, bringing friends and neighbors together in quiet concern. Every person who heard about it seemed affected in some way, touched by the story of Jim and Duke. The quiet elderly architect with his loyal dog had always been a comforting presence in town, a symbol of the kind of gentle, steady life that Pine Hollow prided itself on. At the local hospital, Jim was in a medically induced coma, giving his heart a chance to rest and heal. Doctors were optimistic but cautious, and though Jim's vitals were stable, His recovery remained uncertain. This left Duke in a state of despair. Back at the station, he was constantly restless, refusing food and water, his gaze fixed on the door, as though expecting Jim to walk through it at any moment. True to her word, Officer Claire Thompson had taken it upon herself to care for Duke. She felt a deep responsibility, not only to honor Jim's trust, but also to ensure Duke didn't feel abandoned in his moment of need. Duke, in turn, had developed a tentative trust in Claire. He allowed her to feed him scraps, though he ate sparingly, and he would sometimes lay his head in her lap, his eyes a mixture of sadness and resilience. As the days turned into a week, Claire found herself reflecting on her own journey. She had come back to Pine Hollow looking for peace, a break from the relentless pace and harsh realities she'd encountered as a police officer in the city. She'd returned hoping for connection, a life rooted in community. But Duke's loyalty and heartache stirred something within her, reminding her of why she'd become an officer in the first place: to help, to protect, and to be a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. One evening, as Claire sat with Duke in her small office at the station, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Rachel Walker, the jogger who had found Jim on the morning of his collapse. She had grown concerned for Duke's well-being and wanted to see if she could help in any way. Claire agreed to meet her at the station the next morning. True to her word, Rachel arrived at the crack of dawn, holding a bag of Duke's favorite treats. She was a kind-hearted woman with a gentle, calming presence, someone who'd lived in Pine Hollow her whole life and had known Jim for years. Seeing Duke's forlorn expression, Rachel knelt down and offered him a treat, her voice soft as she spoke words of comfort. Duke sniffed the treat but ignored it, resting his head back down on his paws, his eyes half closed and distant. "He's so loyal, isn't he?" Rachel said, her voice tinged with admiration. "I think Jim might be the only person in his world." Claire nodded. "I've never seen a dog so devoted. It's as if he believes his entire purpose is to be with Jim. And now that he's not, it's like he doesn't know how to go on." The two women sat with Duke in silence for a while, each feeling the weight of his loss in their own way. Claire felt compelled to do something more, but she wasn't sure what. She found herself confiding in Rachel about her thoughts. "I've been wondering if maybe a hospital would let him visit Jim," Claire said softly. "It sounds unconventional, I know, but Duke is practically wasting away here. I think being close to Jim, even for a short time, might help them both." Rachel's eyes lit up with hope. "That's a wonderful idea. I've heard of therapy animals visiting patients. Maybe, with some persuasion, they'd allow it." The next day, with Duke still by her side, Claire went to the hospital and made her case to Dr. Evans, the head physician overseeing Jim's care. At first, the doctor was hesitant, concerned about hygiene and potential risks. But Claire's plea, combined with her description of Duke's devotion and declining condition, made Dr. Evans pause. He, too, had grown up in Pine Hollow and knew Jim's story well. After much discussion, he agreed to a single, carefully supervised visit. The day of the visit arrived, and Claire could feel Duke's energy shift as soon as they approached the hospital. His ears perked up, his pace quickened, and his tail wagged faintly. She couldn't shake the sense that Duke knew, in his heart, where they were going. She walked him through the hospital corridors, guided by a nurse, until they reached the IQ. Outside the room, Duke whined softly, his eyes locked on the door, as if he could sense Jim's presence just beyond it. Claire opened the door, allowing Duke to enter first. The sight that met her eyes was unexpectedly moving. Duke trotted straight to Jim's bedside, his nose nudging Jim's hand as he let out a low, mournful whine. It was a sound that spoke of loss, loyalty, and love all at once, and it resonated with everyone in the room. Dr. Evans and the nurses watched, visibly moved, as Duke settled at Jim's side, resting his head on the edge of the bed. Jim's hand, still and pale, lay close to Duke, and though he was unconscious, his presence seemed to calm Duke in a way that nothing else had. Claire blinked back tears as she watched the two of them, realizing that this bond was unlike anything she'd ever seen. Duke stayed by Jim's side for nearly an hour, his breathing slowing, his entire posture relaxed. For the first time since Jim's collapse, Duke appeared at peace. That night, Claire couldn't shake the memory of the visit. The connection between Jim and Duke reminded her of her own family, of the relationships she'd let slip away over the years as she moved from one city to another. She thought about her younger sister, Anna, who still lived nearby, but whom she barely saw. She wondered when she'd last made the effort to really be present for someone in her life. As Claire settled into bed, she made a promise to herself. She would be there for Duke, for Jim, and for Pine Hollow. And in the back of her mind, she felt a renewed determination to be there for her own family, too. Over the next few weeks, the story of Duke's visit spread throughout Pine Hollow, and people rallied together to support Jim's recovery. Small acts of kindness began to multiply, neighbors pitching in to tend Jim's garden, others bringing meals for Claire and Duke at the station. The town's local cafe even put out a donation jar to help cover Jim's medical expenses. It was a quiet but powerful movement, one that reminded Claire of the strength of community and the importance of bonds, no matter how unconventional. Then, one chilly morning, Claire received a call from the hospital. Jim's condition had taken a slight turn for the better. His doctors believed that the familiar comfort of Duke's presence might have had an effect on his recovery. Hope stirred in Claire's heart as she shared the news with the people who'd come to know and care about Duke's story. They all felt connected to Jim now, united by a shared sense of purpose, of wanting to see him pull through. That same evening, Tommy, Jim's young friend, arrived at the station, his eyes bright with hope. He had heard about Duke's visit to the hospital and was eager to see the dog again. "Can I sit with him for a while?" he asked shyly, clutching a small book he'd borrowed from Jim's cottage. Claire nodded, touched by Tommy's devotion. Of course, Tommy. He could use some company. Tommy sat on the floor beside Duke, opening the book and beginning to read softly. Claire watched from her desk, moved by the quiet resilience in the boy. His voice was steady, filled with childlike wonder, and Duke's ears twitched as he listened, his body seeming to relax further with each word. As Tommy read, Claire felt a swell of gratitude for these moments, for the chance to witness the bonds that seemed to be forming around Jim and Duke's story. She saw how their love was inspiring everyone around them to reach out, to care, to be present in ways they hadn't been before. For the first time since returning to Pine Hollow, Claire felt truly at home, anchored by the connections she was forging, both with the people of the town and with Duke, the dog who taught her the true meaning of loyalty and love. As Tommy continued reading, Claire looked around at the station's modest walls, at Duke resting beside the boy, and realized that this was only the beginning. Pine Hollow was changing, bit by bit, drawn together by Jim and Duke's story. And Claire knew, deep down, that she too was changing, rediscovering parts of herself she thought she'd lost along the way. Hope in the hollow. As the leaves in Pine Hollow deepened to shades of amber and russet, the town buzzed with quiet anticipation. News of Jim's gradual recovery lifted spirits. But for most people, it was the tale of Duke's unwavering loyalty that touched them deeply. People spoke of Duke at the town's cafe, in grocery aisles, and even during Sunday service, where the pastor dedicated a sermon to the virtues of loyalty, love, and compassion inspired by Duke's story. For Claire, life had become a balancing act between her duties as a police officer and her growing involvement in Jim and Duke's story. She hadn't expected her return to Pine Hollow to lead her into such uncharted emotional territory. But as she worked with Duke, supported Tommy, and handled the community's concerns for Jim, Claire realized that this journey was bringing her closer to the essence of why she'd chosen to be in law enforcement. In a way, Duke was becoming a bridge for people who had otherwise felt disconnected. One of those people was Tommy, who had taken to visiting Duke nearly every day after school, each time bringing something special with him. A story, a small snack, a trinket he thought Duke might like. Tommy had grown more attached to Duke, often staying for hours, sometimes until Claire had to gently coax him back home to his mother, Kelly. Kelly, in her mid-30s and visibly weary from the demands of her job, had begun to visit the station herself to check on Tommy. She would arrive after her evening shift at the diner, her hands still smelling of coffee and cleaning solution, her hair pulled back in a loose bun. She was grateful for Claire's support and even more appreciative of Duke's calm, steadfast presence, which seemed to help Tommy as much as it did her. "Thank you, Officer Thompson," Kelly said one evening, her eyes a mix of gratitude and sadness. "You have no idea how much this means to us. With everything that's happened, it feels good to have someone looking out for Tommy." Claire smiled gently, but she felt the weight of Kelly's words. She could see the loneliness and struggle in her eyes, the invisible burdens that came with raising a child alone. Claire reached out, squeezing Kelly's hand, and said, "We're all looking out for each other here. And please, call me Claire." Kelly returned the smile, her expression softening. For the first time in years, she felt the warmth of a community surrounding her and her son, a support network that she hadn't realized she needed. As the days passed, Claire worked tirelessly, arranging more frequent visits for Duke to see Jim at the hospital. Each visit seemed to lift Jim's spirits, and his doctors noticed a remarkable improvement. Jim's recovery was slow but steady, and he was beginning to regain strength, his condition inching closer to stable with each passing day. The connection between Jim and Duke was evident to everyone at the hospital, and Dr. Evans was now a staunch advocate for these therapeutic visits, citing Duke as a key part of Jim's healing process. One crisp morning, Claire received a call from Dr. Evans. "Officer Thompson, Jim is awake," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "He's asking for Duke." Claire's heart leaped. She had been waiting for this moment, hoping for it every day since the incident. She looked at Duke, who was lying on the floor beside her desk, and felt a wave of gratitude for the dog who had brought so much light to their community. Without delay, she made her way to the hospital with Duke. As they walked through the halls, Duke seemed to sense the change, his tail wagging with a mix of excitement and relief. Claire led him into Jim's room, where he was lying propped up in bed, looking weaker and older than she remembered, but with a spark of life in his eyes. The moment Duke saw Jim, he let out a soft bark of joy, his entire body trembling with excitement. Jim, too, reacted immediately, reaching out a shaky hand as Duke trotted over and nuzzled it. The reunion was powerful, a quiet but profound exchange that spoke volumes. Jim's eyes filled with tears as he murmured, "There's my boy. My loyal Duke." Duke whimpered softly, licking Jim's hand, his eyes filled with a devotion that seemed to transcend mere companionship. Claire felt her own eyes prick with tears as she watched the reunion, deeply moved by the bond between them. The nurses, too, paused in the hallway, watching the scene unfold, a few of them wiping away tears. In that quiet room, it was clear that Duke wasn't just a dog. He was a part of Jim, a living testament to the power of love. Over the next few days, Jim's recovery gained momentum, each visit with Duke bolstering his spirits. The doctors noted that his blood pressure improved, his appetite increased, and his overall mental outlook seemed brighter. Jim spoke often of the things he wanted to do once he was discharged, tending to his garden, walking with Duke along their favorite trails, and visiting the library with Tommy. One afternoon, Tommy came to visit Jim at the hospital. He clutched a small bundle of wildflowers he had picked himself, shyly handing them to Jim as he approached the bed. Jim's face broke into a warm smile, and he patted the side of his bed, inviting Tommy to sit. Duke settled at their feet, his eyes flicking back and forth as he took in the scene. "How are you holding up, kiddo?" Jim asked, his voice still weak but filled with warmth. "I'm okay, Mr. Marshall," Tommy replied, looking down at his hands. "I missed you, though, and Duke missed you a lot." Jim chuckled, reaching out to ruffle Tommy's hair. "I missed you both, too. I'm grateful to have a friend like you, Tommy." Tommy beamed, his face lighting up with joy. For a moment, the shadows that often lurked in his eyes disappeared, replaced by a genuine happiness that Claire hadn't seen in him before. The relationship between Jim and Tommy was more than just a mentorship. It was a bond that filled a void in both their lives, one that went beyond age or circumstance. As the days turned to weeks, the entire town became involved in Jim's journey of recovery. The cafe held a fundraiser, selling Duke's Delight cookies and Jim's Brew coffee, with all proceeds going toward Jim's medical expenses. At the school, Tommy's classmates wrote get-well cards and drew pictures of Duke and Jim, which Claire pinned up on the station's bulletin board. Even the local library organized a book drive in Jim's honor, dedicating a new reading corner to him and his legacy as a mentor to Pine Hollow's children. One evening, after her shift ended, Claire walked over to Jim's cottage with Duke and Tommy. She wanted to check on the house, and Tommy was eager to help. As they stepped onto the front porch, Claire felt a familiar sense of calm settle over her. The cottage was quiet, and the garden lay dormant, waiting for its caretaker to return. Tommy knelt by a patch of flowers that had wilted in the cold, gently brushing away some fallen leaves. "Do you think Mr. Marshall will be able to come home soon?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with hope. Claire nodded, giving him a reassuring smile. "He's getting stronger every day, Tommy. I think he'll be back before we know it." Duke wandered around the yard, sniffing the familiar spots where he and Jim used to spend hours together. He seemed more at ease, as though he, too, could sense that things were slowly returning to normal. Claire watched him, her heart swelling with gratitude for this remarkable dog who had brought so much hope to the town. As they worked together, cleaning up the garden and straightening up the front porch, Claire felt a warmth in her heart that had been missing for years. She felt connected, not just to Jim and Duke, but to Pine Hollow as a whole. This town was more than just a place to live. It was a community, a family, and she was proud to be a part of it. When they were finished, they all sat together on the porch steps, watching as the sky turned shades of purple and gold with the setting sun. Tommy leaned against Claire, his eyes growing heavy with sleep, while Duke lay beside them, content and peaceful. In that quiet moment, Claire realized that her journey back to Pine Hollow had been more than just a return to her roots. It had been a journey of healing, of finding purpose, and of rediscovering the importance of love, loyalty, and family. The stars began to twinkle above, casting a gentle glow over the cottage. Claire looked up, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She knew that Jim would be back soon, that he and Duke would walk these trails again, and that Pine Hollow would be a better place because of it. And as she sat there with Tommy and Duke, Claire felt a quiet resolve growing within her, a determination to keep supporting her community, to continue being there for those who needed her, and to honor the bonds that made Pine Hollow the remarkable place it was. Trials of the heart. As winter began to settle over Pine Hollow, Jim was finally discharged from the hospital. The townsfolk gathered outside the hospital on a chilly afternoon, waving hand-painted banners and signs as Jim, still weak but smiling, was wheeled out by Claire and a nurse. Duke trotted faithfully beside him, eyes bright with relief and joy, his tail wagging so hard it seemed to shake his whole body. The gathering of townsfolk wasn't a grand spectacle, but it was heartfelt. Neighbors brought flowers, homemade scarves, and warm meals. Mrs. Reynolds, who ran the local bakery, handed Jim a basket filled with his favorite muffins, while Rachel Walker gave him a hand-knitted blanket she'd made just for him. "Welcome back, Jim," she said with a warm smile. "Pine Hollow hasn't been the same without you." Jim, clearly touched, thanked each person with quiet gratitude. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had chosen to stay in Pine Hollow all his life. As they made their way back to his cottage, Jim was struck by how much he had missed the simple beauty of his town, the familiar streets dusted with snow, the twinkling lights hanging from storefronts, and the warmth of familiar faces around him. When they reached the cottage, Tommy was waiting on the porch, a broad smile on his face. He had been there every day, cleaning up the yard, dusting off the steps, and even trying his hand at sweeping the porch. His small acts of care and devotion hadn't gone unnoticed by the neighbors, who had quietly assisted him with little tasks around the cottage, ensuring that Jim would return to a home that felt just as it had before. "Mr. Marshall." Tommy ran up to him as soon as he arrived, hugging him tightly around the waist. "I'm so glad you're back. I took care of Duke and the house for you. We all missed you." Jim's heart melted as he hugged the boy back, feeling the sincerity in Tommy's embrace. "Thank you, Tommy. I missed you too, and I'm so grateful to have such a wonderful friend looking out for me." Claire watched the reunion, her heart swelling with pride. It was clear that Jim's presence was a grounding force for both Tommy and Duke, and she felt a sense of fulfillment knowing she had played a part in reuniting them. For weeks, she had been juggling the delicate balance between her duties as an officer and her growing involvement with Jim, Tommy, and Duke. And though it had been exhausting, seeing Jim back in his rightful place made it all worthwhile. As Jim settled back into his cottage, Claire realized her role was far from over. Jim would need help adjusting to life at home as he regained his strength, and Duke, though relieved to have Jim back, still clung to him with a protective intensity. To support Jim's recovery, the townsfolk took turns visiting him, bringing meals, running errands, and keeping him company on cold winter nights. One snowy evening, Claire and Kelly Harris, Tommy's mother, brought over a pot of stew. Kelly had recently started visiting Jim's cottage, often in the evenings after her shifts at the diner. It was a slow, gentle way to offer companionship without intruding, and she found herself growing close to Jim, drawn to his quiet wisdom and kindness. "Mr. Marshall, I can take care of the dishes," Kelly offered after dinner, her voice soft as she gathered the plates. "You just sit and rest." Jim smiled at her with appreciation. "Kelly, please call me Jim. And thank you. I'd be lost without the kindness you and Claire have shown me. It means more than you know." As Kelly washed up, Claire noticed the quiet understanding between her and Jim. It was subtle, but there was a warmth and respect there that seemed to transcend words. For years, Kelly had shouldered the burdens of single motherhood alone, rarely accepting help from anyone. But here, in Jim's cottage, she found herself letting her guard down. Jim's gentle demeanor created a safe space, a place where she could simply be herself without judgment. Once the dishes were done, they all settled by the fireplace, watching the flames flicker and dance. Tommy sat on the floor next to Duke, resting his head against the dog's warm side as he read aloud from one of the books Jim had lent him. The cottage was filled with a peaceful silence, punctuated only by Tommy's voice and the crackling of the fire. For Claire, it felt like a moment of stillness in a world that often seemed too fast, too loud, and too disconnected. As the evening wore on, Jim noticed Claire's thoughtful expression. He had seen this look on her before, usually when she was deep in thought or wrestling with something unresolved. "Claire," Jim said gently, "I haven't had the chance to properly thank you. You did more than just keep an eye on Duke. You've been a friend to all of us." Claire looked at him, a little taken aback. "I was just doing my job, Jim." Jim shook his head, his gaze warm and knowing. "You went above and beyond. You brought people together. And you reminded this town what it means to truly care for one another. That's not just a job. That's a calling." Claire felt a rush of emotions she hadn't expected. She had joined the police force to help people, but over time, the job had become more about routine and procedure, with little room for genuine human connection. Yet here, in Pine Hollow, she had rediscovered that calling, that deeper purpose that had first inspired her to serve. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. As winter settled into its deepest, quietest phase, Claire began spending more time with her own family. She reached out to her sister, Anna, with whom she had grown distant over the years. Anna, a single mother to a young daughter, had been struggling quietly, much like Kelly, and Claire realized how much she had missed by being away. One evening, she invited Anna and her daughter, Lily, to join her at Jim's cottage. The warmth and camaraderie there had a way of breaking down barriers, and Claire hoped that bringing her family into this circle would help her reconnect with them. The evening was lively and filled with laughter. Tommy and Lily became fast friends, playing with Duke as Jim and Anna chatted by the fireplace. It was a night of stories, shared memories, and simple joys, and for Claire, it was a reminder of the power of family, both the family you're born into and the family you find along the way. Meanwhile, Jim's cottage became a place of quiet transformation for the community. People who had once been strangers now came together regularly, sharing meals, stories, and support. The fundraiser at the cafe continued, with townsfolk donating time and money to help cover Jim's medical expenses. Claire had never seen such unity in Pine Hollow before, and it was clear that Jim and Duke's story had touched everyone in profound ways. But there was one unresolved matter that weighed on her heart: Tommy's father, who had left his family years ago, leaving a trail of pain and disappointment in his wake. Tommy rarely spoke of him, but on one of their walks, he opened up to Claire, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "Why did he leave us, Officer Claire?" he asked quietly, looking down at his feet. "Why didn't he want to stay with me and Mom?" Claire's heart ached at the boy's vulnerability. She knelt down, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Tommy, sometimes people make choices that hurt others. And sometimes, those choices don't have anything to do with us. They're about the person who made them." Tommy nodded slowly, his eyes filled with understanding, but also a sadness that no child should have to carry. "I just wish he had tried." Claire hugged him, feeling the weight of his pain. "You have so many people who care about you. Tommy, your mom, Mr. Marshall, me, and Duke. You're not alone." That night, Claire reflected on her own life and the connection she had allowed to drift over the years. She realized that healing wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about building something new, about creating bonds that could carry you through the storms of life. And as she looked around the cozy, firelit cottage, surrounded by friends and family, she felt a peace settle over her heart. The following week, Jim's recovery took another significant step forward. With the help of his neighbors, he began venturing out of his cottage, taking short walks with Duke by his side. Each step was a victory, a reminder of his resilience and the strength he'd found in the love and support of his community. The townsfolk continued to rally around Jim, hosting gatherings and potlucks in his honor. The bonds that had formed in Pine Hollow were no longer just a temporary response to a crisis. They were becoming the foundation of a community that valued connection, compassion, and loyalty. For Claire, this journey had been transformative. She had found purpose, family, and a renewed sense of duty to Pine Hollow. She knew that her place was here, among these people, working not just as a police officer, but as a friend, a neighbor, and a part of the community. And as the snow fell gently over Pine Hollow, blanketing the town in a quiet peace, Claire felt a deep contentment settle within her. She had come home, in every sense of the word, and for the first time in a long time, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be, a heart of winter. As Pine Hollow moved further into the depths of winter, the bond that had grown within the town seemed to only grow stronger, like an ember in the coal that refused to be snuffed out. Jim continued to make strides in his recovery, slowly regaining strength with the help of Duke, Claire, and the community that surrounded him. The heart of Pine Hollow beat a little warmer that winter, unified by the journey they had shared. For Claire, winter brought with it a season of reflection. Each day she spent with Jim, Duke, Tommy, and Kelly had a way of peeling back layers of her own defenses, revealing the parts of herself she'd kept hidden for so long. Her time in the city had made her efficient, resilient, and unyielding, but here in Pine Hollow, she was rediscovering a gentler side, a part of herself that longed for connection rather than distance. One day, after a long patrol shift, Claire decided to pay Jim and Duke a visit. She brought along a freshly baked loaf of bread from Mrs. Reynolds' bakery, and as she knocked on the cottage door, She could already hear the sound of Duke's paws scratching against the floor in excitement. Jim opened the door with a warm smile, his eyes crinkling with gratitude. "Claire, come in," he said, holding the door open as Duke greeted her with an enthusiastic nuzzle. Inside, the cottage was filled with the warm scent of pine and cinnamon. Jim had set up a modest Christmas tree in the corner, decorated with simple ornaments and a string of soft yellow lights. Seeing the decorations reminded Claire of her own family and the holiday traditions they used to have before she left for the city. "Nice tree," Claire remarked, placing the bread on the kitchen counter. "I don't think I've seen a better one in town." Jim chuckled, glancing over at the tree with a twinkle in his eye. "Tommy helped me pick it out. Said it had to be just right for Duke and me. He's been quite the holiday expert." Claire smiled, picturing Tommy's enthusiasm. She had watched the boy blossom over the past few months, his confidence growing with each day he spent with Jim and Duke. Pine Hollow had given him a place to feel safe, to feel valued, and she could see the profound difference it had made in his life. As they sat by the fire, Duke settled comfortably at Jim's feet, and Claire found herself asking Jim about his life. Things she hadn't thought to ask before. She learned about his younger days as an architect, about the dreams he had once pursued with Ella, and about the beautiful partnership they had shared. Jim's voice grew soft as he spoke of Ella, a fondness lingering in his words that spoke of love as timeless as the mountains that framed Pine Hollow. "It wasn't always easy," Jim said, his gaze distant as he stared into the fire. "But Ella had a way of finding light in the darkest times. She used to tell me that love was like a fire. You had to tend it, keep it safe from the storms. And I think that's what kept us together all those years." Claire nodded, feeling a quiet admiration for Jim's resilience and his capacity for love. "I think you've kept that fire alive, Jim. Not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. Look at how this town has rallied together. You're the heart of it, whether you realize it or not." Jim's cheeks flushed, clearly touched by her words. "I just try to do right by people. Sometimes that's all we can do in this world." Their conversation lingered into the night, stretching into hours as they talked of life, love, and the subtle threads that connected them all. Claire felt her heart growing lighter, her purpose more defined. She could see now that coming back to Pine Hollow had been more than just a career decision. It had been a chance to rebuild her own life from the roots, to redefine what home truly meant. As she prepared to leave, Jim stopped her, a glimmer of hesitation in his eyes. "Claire, there's something I'd like you to consider. I've been thinking a lot about Duke's future. You've seen the bond between us, and I know you love him as much as I do." Claire's heart skipped a beat. She'd grown attached to Duke over the months, more than she cared to admit. The thought of losing him was a hollow ache, yet she couldn't imagine him belonging to anyone else but Jim. "Jim, you're both a part of each other's lives. I couldn't imagine separating you two." Jim nodded, but his expression grew thoughtful. "I know, but the time will come when I won't be able to care for him the way he deserves. When that time comes, I'd like you to be there for him. I've seen the way he trusts you, the way he looks at you, and I know he'd be in good hands." Claire was deeply moved by Jim's words, but she couldn't find the right words to respond. Instead, she reached out, taking his hand in hers, a silent promise passing between them. She understood now that Jim wasn't asking her for an immediate commitment. He was simply sharing his trust, his hope, and his love for Duke with someone he believed would carry it forward. Winter in Pine Hollow was known for its quiet beauty, and as the snow fell softly on the rooftops and trees, the town seemed to fall into a peaceful lull. But the peace was not without its challenges. In the coming days, a heavy snowstorm was forecasted, one of the worst Pine Hollow had seen in years. The townsfolk busied themselves preparing for the storm, stockpiling firewood, groceries, and emergency supplies. On the night the storm hit, Claire was on duty at the police station, monitoring the roads and keeping an eye out for anyone who might need help. She checked in with Jim by phone, making sure he had everything he needed, and that Duke was safe. Jim assured her that he was fine, that he had enough firewood and food to last him through the storm. But as the storm intensified, Claire's instincts kicked in. She couldn't shake the feeling that Jim might need more help than he realized. She had just decided to check on him when her phone buzzed. It was Tommy's mother, Kelly. "Claire, Tommy's missing." Kelly's voice trembled with panic. "I went to check on him, and he's not in his room. I think he went to Jim's cottage." Claire's heart leaped in alarm. Tommy had been visiting Jim nearly every day, and she knew how worried he had been about Jim's recovery. But venturing out in a storm like this was dangerous, especially for a young boy. "I'm on my way," Claire assured her, grabbing her coat and flashlight before heading out into the snow. The drive to Jim's cottage was treacherous. The snow fell so thick and fast that it was difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The roads were slick, and the wind howled through the trees, bending them under the weight of the storm. But Claire pressed on, her mind focused on reaching Tommy and Jim before the storm worsened. When she finally arrived, she saw the faint glow of a candle through Jim's window. She knocked on the door, and it was opened by a visibly relieved Jim, who pulled her inside quickly. "Claire, I wasn't expecting you, but I'm glad you're here," he said, his voice warm despite the concern in his eyes. Duke was at his side, his ears perked, sensing the urgency. "Tommy's missing," Claire said, cutting straight to the point. "Kelly thinks he might have come here to check on you." Jim's face fell, and he looked around. "I haven't seen him. But if he's out there alone..." His voice trailed off, fear clouding his eyes. Without another word, Claire grabbed her flashlight and turned back toward the door. Jim tried to stop her, his voice filled with worry. "Claire, the storm's too dangerous. Let me come with you." "No, Jim," she said firmly, touching his arm. "Stay here with Duke. If Tommy does make his way here, I want you to be ready for him." With Jim's reluctant nod, she headed back out into the blizzard, her heart pounding. She searched through the dark, calling out Tommy's name as she pushed forward through the snow. Her flashlight beam cut through the swirling white, illuminating only brief stretches of ground as she stumbled along the path that led back toward town. After what felt like hours of searching, Claire finally spotted a small figure huddled beneath a pine tree, shivering in the bitter cold. She rushed to him, wrapping her arms around him and holding him close. "Tommy, thank goodness I found you," she said, her voice a mixture of relief and urgency. "Are you all right?" Tommy looked up at her, his face pale but determined. "I wanted to make sure Mr. Marshall was okay. I couldn't sleep knowing he might need help." Claire hugged him tightly, her heart breaking and swelling with pride at the same time. "You're a brave kid, Tommy, but you should have told your mom where you were going." Together, they made their way back to Jim's cottage, the snow swirling around them as they trudged through the storm. When they arrived, Jim and Duke were waiting anxiously at the door, and Tommy immediately ran into Jim's arms, seeking comfort in the warmth of his embrace. "I'm sorry, Mr. Marshall," Tommy whispered. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." Jim held him close, his voice filled with love. "I'm more than all right, Tommy, thanks to you." As they all gathered by the fire, safe and warm, Claire felt a sense of peace settle over her. The storm raged on outside, but here, within the walls of Jim's cottage, they had found safety in each other. It was a reminder of the strength they had gained through their shared journey, a testament to the bonds they had built. And as Claire looked around at the faces of her friends, her heart full of gratitude, she knew that this moment was a gift, a moment that transcended the hardships of life, a moment she would carry with her for the rest of her days. Bonds forged in winter's heart. The morning after the storm, Pine Hollow lay blanketed in silence, the snow thick and undisturbed under a pale blue sky. The whole town seemed to shimmer under the weight of winter's hold, each rooftop and tree limb coated in white. The world felt still, as though holding its breath after the storm's fury. Yet within Jim's cottage, warmth and life flowed like a steady current. Inside, Jim, Claire, Tommy, Kelly, and Duke were gathered around the fireplace. They had stayed up late into the night, talking, laughing, and sharing stories. The warmth of the fire reflected in their faces, casting a golden glow that softened the lines of worry and fatigue that had etched themselves during the long winter months. Each of them had braved their own storms, both literal and emotional, yet they were here, together, forming a refuge for one another. Claire glanced around the room, her gaze lingering on each of them, feeling a profound gratitude that seemed to swell in her chest. Pine Hollow had transformed her life, but not in the way she had expected. What she had found was far more valuable than the peaceful escape she'd originally sought. She had found a community, a family of choice, and a renewed sense of purpose that filled her heart. The cabin door creaked open as Claire's sister, Anna, and her daughter Lily stepped in, their faces flushed from the cold. Anna was carrying a thermos of hot cocoa and a tin of homemade gingerbread cookies. Her face lit up with a warm smile as she saw Claire, and she gave her a quick hug before settling by the fire. Lily immediately joined Tommy on the floor, and the two children began sharing a book Jim had given them. The sight of the two young faces, engrossed in their story, made Claire feel a deep sense of hope, a feeling that Pine Hollow was not just a place, but an anchor that would hold them all through life's tempests. As everyone warmed up with mugs of cocoa, Jim's voice broke the gentle hum of conversation. "I want to thank each of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This past year, I never expected so much love and support. I've been on this earth a long time, but I can honestly say I've never felt more cared for than I have in these past few months." There was a reverent silence as everyone listened, and even Duke seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, resting his head on Jim's knee as though offering his silent support. Jim reached down, stroking Duke's fur with a tenderness that spoke of years of companionship and love. "I was a bit of a loner, even before I lost Ella," Jim continued, his gaze distant as he remembered his late wife. "But each of you has reminded me of something she always used to say, that the world may be hard and cold at times, but our kindness, our bonds, are what keep us warm." The fire crackled, and for a moment, everyone sat in reflective silence. Kelly, who had been quiet, finally spoke up, her voice soft. "I felt so alone, raising Tommy by myself all these years. I thought it was just something I had to bear. But you, Jim, you reminded me that none of us has to do it alone. Not if we let people in." Tommy, hearing his mother's words, moved closer to her, slipping his small hand into hers. Kelly looked down at him, her eyes brimming with tears, and Claire felt a lump in her throat as she watched them. It was a scene of quiet resilience, of people who had weathered storms and were beginning to understand the power of sharing their burdens. "Kelly," Jim said gently, "you and Tommy have given me a sense of purpose I thought I'd lost. I'm not just some old man watching his days slip by. You've made me feel alive again, like I have something to live for." The depth of gratitude in Jim's voice brought tears to Kelly's eyes, and she squeezed his hand, her gaze full of warmth and understanding. Anna, who had been listening quietly, chimed in with a chuckle. "You know, if I didn't have Lily and you all around, I'd probably have gone mad by now. I never thought Pine Hollow would become such a big part of our lives again, but I don't think I'd want to be anywhere else." Claire smiled, feeling her own heart resonate with Anna's words. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed her family, her sister's laughter, and the small moments of comfort they used to share. She was grateful to have been reminded of what truly mattered. At that moment, a loud knock on the door broke the quiet, and everyone turned in surprise. Claire rose to open it, and standing there, bundled up against the cold, was an unexpected figure, Tommy's father, David Harris. He looked nervous, his eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was a quiet determination in his expression. "Hello, everyone," he said, nodding to the group, though his gaze lingered on Tommy and Kelly. "I know I'm the last person any of you expected to see, but I need to make things right." The room fell silent, the warmth of the fire contrasting sharply with the tension that suddenly filled the space. Kelly's face was unreadable, her emotions guarded, and Tommy's eyes were wide with shock, a mix of curiosity and apprehension. David took a tentative step forward, looking down at Tommy. "I know I've hurt you. I left when I should have stayed. I thought I could make things better if I figured myself out first. But I was wrong. I see now that all I did was hurt the people I loved the most." Tommy's gaze shifted from his mother to his father, struggling to process his feelings. Claire watched him, her heart aching for the boy who had been forced to grow up faster than he should have. Kelly cleared her throat, her voice steady. "David, you can't just show up and expect everything to go back to the way it was." David nodded, his expression filled with regret. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness. But I want to try. I want to be part of Tommy's life if you'll let me." The room was thick with silence, but it was Jim who broke it, his voice filled with calm wisdom. "Second chances aren't given. They're earned. If you want to be a part of Tommy's life, David, you'll have to show him that he can trust you again." David looked at Jim with gratitude, nodding. "I understand. I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Kelly's gaze softened just slightly, her expression thoughtful. "We'll see, David. For Tommy's sake, I'm willing to try. But I'll be watching. We'll all be watching." With that, the tension eased, replaced by a tentative sense of hope. David stayed for a while, talking to Tommy, who listened with a mixture of guarded interest and skepticism. It was a step, a small one, but the beginning of what could be a long road to redemption. As the day wore on, the storm outside melted into a gentle snowfall, and a gathering in Jim's cottage felt like a celebration of the bonds they had created. By nightfall, everyone had moved to the small dining table, sharing a meal and swapping stories. David, hesitant at first, began to open up, his presence slowly blending into the warmth of the group. Claire felt a deep contentment as she watched her friends, her family, sharing laughter and love around the table. She realized that this was what she had been searching for all along, a sense of belonging, a purpose beyond her badge, a place to call home. After dinner, as the children played with Duke on the rug, Jim asked Claire to join him by the fireplace. He looked at her, a twinkle in his eye, and said, "Claire, I've been thinking. You're not just a friend to me. You're like family. And I think it's time I make that official." Claire raised an eyebrow, taken aback. "What do you mean?" Jim pulled out a small worn envelope and handed it to her. Inside was a letter, handwritten in Jim's elegant script. It was his will, leaving his cottage, his belongings, and Duke in her care. "Jim, I can't," Claire began, her eyes wide with disbelief. But Jim shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "I want you to have it, Claire. I've lived a good life, and I know I'm not going anywhere just yet," he added with a chuckle. "But when my time comes, I want Duke to be with someone he loves and trusts. And I want this cottage to remain a place of warmth and refuge. I know you'll honor that." Tears pricked at Claire's eyes as she looked down at the letter, feeling the weight of Jim's trust. She hugged him, words failing her, but Jim understood. He patted her shoulder, his smile filled with the quiet satisfaction of a man at peace. That night, after everyone had left and the cottage was quiet again, Claire sat by the fire with Duke curled up at her feet. She thought of all that had happened, the journey that had brought her back to Pine Hollow, the friendships she had formed, and the love that had woven itself into the fabric of her life here. She realized that this wasn't just Jim's gift. It was her purpose, her calling to continue the legacy of kindness, warmth, and community he had built. In the days that followed, Pine Hollow returned to its peaceful routine, but something had changed. The bonds they had forged that winter were unbreakable, a testament to the strength they had found in each other. David worked to rebuild his relationship with Tommy, joining them for dinners and taking slow, careful steps to regain their trust. Kelly found a renewed sense of hope, supported by friends who had become family. And Jim, though growing older, found joy in knowing that his legacy would live on through Claire and Duke. As spring arrived and the snow melted, Claire took over Jim's garden, planting new flowers alongside Tommy and Anna. She had found her place, her home, and as she watched the flowers bloom under the warming sun, she knew that Pine Hollow had forever changed her. She looked down at Duke, who was happily sniffing around the garden, and felt a surge of gratitude. The love, the loyalty, the community they had built would carry them through every season, every challenge, for as long as they lived. And in her heart, Claire knew that she was no longer just passing through life. She was truly living it here, in the quiet beauty of Pine Hollow.